As spring turned to summer in 1994, no ball club was hotter than the Montreal Expos. They were young, they were talented, and they couldn't stop winning. For a third year in a row, the Commissioner's Trophy seemed destined for Canada, but it wasn't. Instead, a late-season work stoppage kiboshed the 1994 campaign, leading to the cancellation of the World Series for the first time in nearly a century and derailing the Expos' best shot at a title. A devastating development that ultimately marked the beginning of the end for Major League Baseball in Montreal. In the early 1990s, Canada was the center of the baseball world. Of course, the Toronto Blue Jays reigned supreme, capturing consecutive World Series titles in '92 and '93, but about 500 kilometers east, the Montreal Expos, MLB's first Canadian franchise, were enjoying a renaissance themselves. In the 1970s, the Expos player development system was the envy of baseball, and by 1993, they'd once again produced a bevy of homegrown stars who were inspiring fear throughout the National League. That year, thanks to the likes of Larry Walker, Marquise Grissom, and Delino DeShields, the Expos went 94-68-1, finishing one win shy of their franchise record and 3 games back of the NL East champion Philadelphia Phillies. And despite missing the playoffs for a 12th consecutive season and the 24th time in their 25-year existence, the Expos had put the league on notice. They were coming. Given their trajectory, some were puzzled when the Expos traded DeShields, their trusty leadoff man, to Los Angeles that offseason for a 22-year-old right-hander with all of 3 Major League starts under his belt, but that deal soon made a genius out of Montreal GM Dan Duquette. The righty's name? Pedro Martinez. Incidentally, Duquette didn't actually stick around to see his deal pay off, leaving Montreal to take over as GM of the Boston Red Sox ahead of spring training. Regardless, between Ken Hill, Jeff Fassero, and this precocious newcomer, the Expos figured to have one of the better rotations in the game, not to mention a lockdown bullpen anchored by one of baseball's premier closers in John Wetland and an elite setup man in Mel Rojas. Meanwhile, between young veterans Walker, Grissom, and Moises Alou, plus 22-year-old Will Cordero and 21-year-old Cliff Floyd, Montreal's lineup oozed with dynamic potential, boasting plenty of power and even more speed. This team was young, the youngest in the league in fact, with a group of position players more than 2 years younger than average, but they were a bona fide contender. At the very least, with the '94 campaign marking the beginning of baseball's wildcard era, which effectively doubled the size of the league's playoff pool, the Expos seemed like a lock to snap their postseason drought. Except, in reality, it took some time for this would-be juggernaut to find its footing. 2 weeks into the season, the Expos were mired in last place in the NL East and already trailed the division-leading Atlanta Braves by 8.5 games. But they were too good to stay down for long. After opening the season 4-9, the Expos won 11 of their next 12 contests to erase their sluggish start and reorient themselves towards a memorable campaign. And boy was it about to get memorable. The Expos went off in June, going 19-8 for the month to break away from the pretenders in the National League and keep pace with the comparably red-hot Braves. Alou and Walker were hitting the cover off the ball. Grissom was an absolute menace on the base paths. In just his second full big league season, Cordero was seemingly blossoming into a star. Meanwhile, Hill and Fassero were making cases for the NL Cy Young Award, while Pedro was establishing himself as one of the best young starters in the game. Everything was clicking, and it wasn't long before the Expos overtook Atlanta atop the division standings. On the eve of the All-Star break, the Expos took sole possession of first place in the NL East, a cheery send-off for the 5-man delegate they sent to the Midsummer Classic. And they'd only get better from that point onward. After dropping 4 straight to kick off the second half, the Expos were virtually unbeatable, winning 14 of their next 15 contests to leave the Braves and the rest of the league in their dust. By late July, the Expos had the best record in all of baseball, and they were downright electrifying. So much so that they even managed to put butts in seats at ghastly Olympic Stadium, drawing more fans per game than they had in a decade. Nothing, it seemed, could stop these Expos, whose pitching staff led the majors in ERA and WHIP, and whose speed-centric offense led the NL in stolen bases and ranked 3rd in runs per game. As it turned out, though, that wasn't exactly true. Right as the Expos were solidifying themselves as the team to beat, labor discord in Major League Baseball was reaching a boiling point. In late July, the Major League Baseball Players Association announced that it would go on strike if a new collective bargaining agreement wasn't in place soon. The previous CBA had expired in December, and although the players took the field in '94 in good faith, with the intention to negotiate as the season played on, the owners didn't make their first proposal until June. When they did, it contained a host of economic changes that were never going to fly with the players, most critically a salary cap. The union rejected that offer, at which point the owners, in an attempt to apply pressure, decided to withhold millions of dollars they were required to pay into the players' pension and benefits plan, further incensing the MLBPA. The union had had enough. They set their strike date for August 12th. And as that fateful date loomed, Montreal just kept on winning. Following that epic stretch of 14 wins in 15 games, the Expos proceeded to win 6 of their next 7 contests, improving their record to a staggering 74-39. It was comfortably the best record in all of baseball, and no team in the NL was within even a half dozen games of them. Their division lead, in fact, remained at 6 games even after they fell 4-0 to the Pittsburgh Pirates on August 11th. Little did they know, however, that that would be the last game they'd play that year. With no new CBA in place, the players' strike commenced at midnight on August 12th, bringing the Expos' magical season to a grinding halt. At the time, it seemed unfathomable that the season wouldn't resume at some point, but as the days and weeks dragged on, progress was minimal. Even with a federal mediator in place to help expedite the proceedings, negotiations proved fruitless. Quickly, September arrived. And 6 days after the owners rejected a union counteroffer, on the 34th day of the strike, Acting Commissioner Bud Selig made the unprecedented, unthinkable decision that changed the course of baseball history. He was canceling the remainder of the season, the playoffs, and, for the first time in 90 years, the World Series. The consequences of that decision would be felt for decades, but in the immediate aftermath of the season's cancellation, no franchise or fan base was more apoplectic than the Expos. Never before had Montreal had a team this good. Not in '79, not in '81, not in '93. This was unequivocally their best shot at a World Series title in their 25-year history. And just like that, it was wiped out, destined to be forgotten. As Walker told The Athletic years later, "We were robbed of what could have been. You can't say we weren't gonna win. We had the best record, and we had the best team." And the Expos weren't alone in their frustration. The cancellation of the '94 season killed several other gripping storylines as well, notably Tony Gwynn's pursuit of a .400 batting average and Matt Williams' chase of Roger Maris's home run record. In the end, Gwynn finished at .394, Williams ended up with 43 dingers, and Montreal was left wondering what if, having achieved nothing more than the least satisfying division title in baseball history. And that gut-wrenching conclusion to their otherwise sublime '94 campaign marked the beginning of the Expos' slow and painful demise in Montreal. First, citing the revenue lost on account of the strike, Expos principal owner Claude Brochu ordered a fire sale ahead of the '95 campaign, effectively blowing up the roster that had played at an 105-win pace the season prior. Grissom, then a 2-time All-Star with a pair of Gold Glove awards, was traded to Atlanta. Hill, who finished second in NL Cy Young voting in '94, was traded back to St. Louis. Wetland was shipped to New York. Meanwhile, Walker, a future Hall of Famer, left for Colorado in free agency. And when the strike-delayed '95 season finally got underway, the Expos were a shell of what they had been. Ultimately, that fire sale, combined with the lingering devastation of '94, chased the fans away in Montreal. The Expos' average attendance plummeted by more than 25% in 1995. And once it became clear that Brochu and his consortium of owners had no intention of ever reinvesting in the franchise, support for the team shriveled up completely. By 1999, just 5 years removed from the strike, the moribund Expos were averaging less than 10,000 fans per game. By 2001, that figure had dropped below 8,000. And by 2005, the Expos were no more, having relocated to Washington, D.C. and rebranded into the Nationals. Shockingly, only a brief moment after the Expos were the best team in the league, Major League Baseball was a distant memory in Montreal. Today, almost 3 decades later, there exists a flicker of hope for baseball's return to La Belle Province, but whether Montreal ends up a Major League city again or not, nothing will ever extinguish the pain of that unfinished '94 season, the devastation of unrealized potential, and the longing for a World Series title that never happened.